Stratегии. Ian Waдлоу here, one of the course leaders on strategy and leadership with the Institute of Directors in London and a presenter with the IDA. And I've been asked to provide some tips for strategy in times of crisis. So here are a few suggestions for you and your team to consider. The first one is establish a ministry of truth. Here in France, where I live, President Macron has announced that we're at war. And in this kind of situation, our most valuable commodity is truth. The board needs actionable information that it can trust if it's to make some big, long-term, far-reaching decisions. So make sure that the team meets regularly to recalibrate and reframe, because crises are highly dynamic with constant shifts, and our view of the truth keeps shifting and morphing accordingly. And you will always want to work on your latest version, not an old or outdated perspective. This was known, I think, by all top generals throughout history. And I tend to quote General Churchman, who in the Vietnam War turned to his staff and said, "You guys are telling me what you think I want to hear. I want to know the truth." So the action for you is to make sure that there is a regular strategy summit meeting which continually challenges, reframes and rearticulates the truth. The board will benefit from one shared common truth. It's a foundation for consensus. Different versions of the truth only bring fracture and disjointed, frenzied and often inappropriate activity. My second tip is for the board to be very clear and focus on the big rocks. You will first of all decide how much resource you've got, and then the second question will be, where does this need to be focused? And examples may be on setting policies and resulting actions. It may be on rejigging the infrastructure setup. It may be on stabilizing your value chain and on customer engagement in particular. It may want to focus on employee security. It may want to focus on stakeholder management. And it may want to focus on a series of stress tests to keep us clear on what resource we've got and for how long. The best example I've got is probably Master Kong, who is a leading instant noodle and beverage manufacturer in China. It reviewed the dynamics on a daily basis and kept reprioritizing its efforts regularly. It anticipated hoarding, it anticipated stockouts, and so as a result of that, tilted its focus away from its regular offline large retail channels into smaller stores and e-commerce so that it could track retail outlets reopening plans, and so was able to adapt its supply chain in a highly flexible manner. As a result, its supply chain recovered by more than 50% just a few weeks after the outbreak, and it was able to supply 60% of those stores, which were the type that were reopening during the current period they were facing, which was 3 times more than its competitors. So for you, my recommendation is to divide and conquer, to resist the temptation to address everything as an imperative, and as a team agree on what the big levers may be and push them hard. Appoint board members as SARs for each of your big rocks so that they maintain focus on that element of the business and focus the energy within the business more like a laser so that you can use precious resource wisely. It will also then be a source of feedback for that all-important version of the truth. The next tip is to encourage broad-based creativity. The one thing we've got now is more time, and staff who are working remotely will want to feel productive, they'll want to feel valuable, and that they're making a difference. So the key thing for me is that the board doesn't have to have all the answers. Put out their problems as games, challenges, split the troops into teams, and ask them for their opinions, because they're out in the field and maybe even better placed for swifter, more daring and more appropriate solutions to immediate threats. One example is Cosmo Lady out in China, who were the largest underwear and lingerie company. They instigated a program to ask what they could do to improve sales, given that everybody was in lockdown. And they basically came up with a solution that they could use WeChat and enlist employees to promote the products to their social circles. The company then created a sales ranking amongst all its employees, including the chairman and the CEO, to help motivate the rest of the staff to participate in the initiative. Another example here in France is that many of the leading restaurants have been in lockdown for several weeks, and one team asked their chefs what they could do to maybe take the restaurant to the people now that the people couldn't come to the restaurant. And so the chefs set up an idea where they now all work from home from online menus and offering part-cooked dishes for home delivery, along with some online instruction and tips for finishing their gourmet dinners, and including wine recommendations that could be delivered from their cellar. So the action for you guys is to frame the problems clearly and then invite others to contribute solutions. It's rather like the movie Apollo 13, where the ground crew realized that if the stranded astronauts were ever going to come home using the lunar landing craft as a lifeboat, the chances are they would run out of air, and that unless they could get rid of the carbon dioxide, they would die. And so Mission Control took it on themselves to find a solution using only items that would be available on the spacecraft. And they came up with a solution that only took the astronauts about an hour to build a device out of plastic bags, cardboard, parts of a lunar suit, and lots of tape. But by seeing the problem coming and anticipating it, setting more minds onto the solution, they came up with an innovative way forward. The next tip is to keep rolling the boulder, especially when it starts to go uphill. The start is just that. It's just the start. And so all these things feel that there will be a tail that follows. And this is another reason for not starting too much, because 12 halves of an elephant is not an elephant, let alone 6. So whatever you start, keep going. And when it gets difficult, the boulder gets heavier, it starts to move uphill. That's the time to keep the energy going and to celebrate whatever progress is being made. A good example of that is every government in the world consulted health experts and virologists about the pandemic that we're all facing. And the message back was universal: to minimize social contact, particularly at mass gatherings, and to increase testing, because without testing, there is none of that truth, no actionable information on the scale or the trajectory of the problem that was being faced. The Philippines responded with a confused, conflicting plan, and nothing happened there. Italy responded by doing sealing off, checkpoints, closing schools, but did little to commit to testing. And in fact, some areas of Italy, including the mayor of Milan, were publicising a "don't change your habits, Milan doesn't stop," which conflicted the advice. Boris Johnson in England said he was testing, even though the main UK manufacturer of the test said that he'd never received any orders from the UK. And while this was happening in South Korea and in Seoul in particular, they were grabbing hold of this issue and they kept pushing the problem. And one hospital in Seoul installed around its building phone booths to offer quick available tests. It effectively was a glass partition with 2 vitrile gloves that came through. And rather like at a prison, you spoke to an advisor on the other side. If they felt that indeed there was a possibility, they could administer the test safely. And then immediately that person left, the test went off, and somebody came out and disinfected the booth, ready for the next one. In the months that the initial months of the problem, the UK tested about 1,000 people in a few days. South Korea managed to test 22,000 by keeping their commitment to testing and coming up with some creative solutions. So the key thing for you is to keep everybody focused on the end game, but to get these teams thinking outside the box and celebrating any short-term wins. reward any progress you get with recognition internally and perhaps externally throughout your stakeholder network. The next tip is resource and prioritize communication. Quite often to a board, communication feels unnecessary, but to our other stakeholders, it's very reassuring. It's also a way of sharing our common truth. And positive messages will breed additional positive actions and outcomes. And by communication, I don't mean just one-way broadcasting. Really, communication is a call for dialogue. It works two ways. And the board will want to listen as part of that understanding and recalibrating its truth. It's a vital source of information. It's also a potent way to enhance brand image and reputation. A good example is the Spanish police force, who have arrived at inner city apartment districts during lockdown with sirens blaring to gain everybody's attention, but armed with musical instruments. And the teams get out, lead the locals in a communal sing-song with actions, and leave to applause before heading off to another area. It's a clever way of preserving law and order. It's also recognising the need to serve and protect. And therefore, surveillance becomes less threatening, and they maintain their brand and give a high visibility. And it supports the sort of purpose of the organisation too. It also gave them some free viral communication. So a very creative way to preserve their situation. Action for you then is, I think, two things. One is to make sure you have a ministry of sound as well as a ministry of truth. I suggest that what you do is get together the communications marketing people with the legal people, because you want to make sure that whatever is being broadcast preserves reputation and doesn't leave us into more problems. And also the operational people need to be involved in that ministry of truth too. For whenever you make a statement, you'll want to make sure that you can deliver on it. Another tip is don't go small. No company is an island. It's part of an increasingly global value web. And if this crisis has proved anything, it shows how interconnected we all are, that we're interlinked. And if we can galvanize concerted action for the common good and the common purpose of preserving the planet for generations to come, that has to be a good thing. So it's overcoming the tendency that when we're fearful to make ourselves small and hunker down and only focus on our own situation. I think the more that we can extend ourselves, offer ourselves to share and assist outside the immediate vicinity, the more strong we'll become. So a good example is perhaps in the US, Amazon have just launched a recruitment drive to find 100,000 new delivery personnel. But in China, more than 40 restaurants, hotels and cinema chains freed up a large portion of their workforce and then offered it to Hema, a new retail supermarket chain owned by Alibaba, which was in urgent need of labour for delivery services due to the sudden increase of online. And now other leading retailers there are following suit by borrowing labour from restaurants and people who are naturally laying off. So an action for you is that a problem shared is a problem halved. And if we can help others in our value chain for the good of all, then I think that will have a knock-on effect. So invite partners to take part in maybe online think tanks to try and solve those problems together. And when you are doing those think tanks, maybe include employees, media, academics, consumers, regulators, other people that may be from outside the organisation. So there are some thoughts to help you. And the final tip is to keep strategizing, because the companies that are looking beyond the immediate and are prepared for life in the new normal will be the ones that go on to be ever stronger and prosper. Any questions or areas that are of concern, please, I'd be delighted to hear from you and delighted to respond. So let's keep in touch, keep safe, keep well, and keep strategizing.